This story will tell us how an ordinary person lived his life, completely unaware that it could change forever overnight. James woke up every morning with the sunrise, checked the tools in his small workshop on the edge of the city, and walked to the tram tracks where his old friends' rusty rails and the familiar smell of grease awaited him. He repaired trams as if they were living creatures. Every route, every turn of the streets, he knew by heart. For James, the city was a map, and the routes were its arteries. He felt them as a pulse, as breath, as music he had known since childhood. Days passed slowly, almost lazily, as if time itself had its own rhythm, and James followed it effortlessly. He drank coffee in the small cafe near the depot, chatting with colleagues about work, weather, or new tracks. Sometimes he stayed late, checking the older trams to ensure that passengers could travel safely the next day. It seemed that life would continue like this forever. Quiet, stable, with trams humming steadily along the streets. But the world around him was already shifting. Rumors of war reached the city, at first distant and almost unbelievable. The news on the radio sounded like background noise not demanding any attention. People discussed it at tables, but in the workshop, James and his colleagues laughed. "Those stories aren't for us. Our city's too small for the horror to reach here." Indeed, every morning he stepped onto the streets, and the city seemed unchanged. Rooftops, sidewalks, the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery, children's laughter echoing through courtyards. Everything appeared normal. James loved observing the city. He knew every corner, shortcuts to avoid traffic, the quickest path to the square, where old lindens grew and pigeons gathered, even which streetlights shone brighter at night. Sometimes he smiled, imagining passengers glancing at the streets while he guided the tram along familiar turns. The city felt like home, not just physically, but spiritually, as if he himself were part of it, and the trams were the veins carrying life through it. Simple joys were enough. A neighbor would give him pastries. Boys in the workshop tried to tease his strictness, and James would chuckle quietly. He dreamed of small weekend trips, reading books, and having time that seemed to belong entirely to him. Everything was ordinary, familiar, and comfortable. But one day, the rhythm of the city changed. James noticed that the streets were quieter than usual. Cars passed less frequently on main avenues, and the radio broadcasts became increasingly alarming. People on the square whispered, and for the first time, he felt the world beyond his workshop creeping into his routine. At first, he could not comprehend the danger, until one morning he saw the first columns of military vehicles slowly moving along the city's outskirts. At first, he refused to believe it. "It's just a drill," James thought. But then he heard the first sirens. They pierced through the usual hum of the trams, and James felt a tight knot in his chest. His heart raced, and his hands clenched his tools unconsciously, as if he already sensed that the familiar routes, streets, and tram rails would soon become a new path, a path he would have to navigate to survive. He looked at the city from his workshop. Familiar houses, people hurrying with worry in their eyes. Everything was recognizable, yet strangely alien. James realized for the first time that his life would never be simple or calm again. Everything he knew and loved, the city, its streets, the trams, could become dangerous. Every familiar route now held uncertainty. That day, he did not know that tomorrow he would become a messenger, guiding people through bombardments, that his knowledge of the streets would save lives, and that passengers would become soldiers, following him as they once followed his trams. But even without knowing, he already felt in his chest that the ordinary life he had known was over, and ahead lay trials that would require courage, strength, and wisdom in a place that had once seemed safe and predictable. James woke up to a city that no longer felt like home. The morning light fell on streets empty of trams, shops shuttered, and smoke rising faintly in the distance. War had arrived, sudden and merciless, and the rhythm of ordinary life had been replaced by uncertainty and fear. Sirens screamed constantly, echoing off the buildings that James had walked past 100 times without a second thought. At first, he tried to continue his routine. He went to the tram depot, but there were no passengers, no colleagues, only empty tracks and the distant rattle of chaos. Then he noticed small groups of people, faces pale, clutching bags and children, trying to move safely through streets that had been familiar only yesterday. James felt a strange responsibility welling up in his chest. Every corner, every shortcut, every tram route he knew perfectly could now mean the difference between life and death. Without hesitation, he became a messenger. He guided people through alleys, across streets that were suddenly riddled with danger, avoiding checkpoints and shelling. He whispered directions to frightened families, led wounded men to safety, and moved silently, almost invisible, through the city he had loved. The knowledge that had once made him an ordinary tram driver now made him invaluable. The first days were chaotic. James felt fear in every step, every heartbeat. Explosions tore through streets he had walked along as a boy. The wind carried the metallic scent of destruction, but he quickly learned that fear could not control him. It had to be managed, harnessed, and converted into awareness. He memorized new patterns, which streets were safe, where soldiers moved, which corners offered cover. Each successful delivery of people or messages strengthened him and drew others' trust. By the second week, he was no longer just guiding civilians. He led groups of soldiers through the city, using the same streets he had once navigated with a tram as his guide. He knew shortcuts through back alleys, blind spots near abandoned buildings, and which bridges were likely to collapse under bombardment. Soldiers began to rely on him. Their respect grew silently, without words, as they saw that James's calm, quiet determination saved lives where maps and strategies failed. One night, while moving a group through a district under shell fire, James realized the transformation within himself. The ordinary man who had repaired trams, who had laughed with neighbors, and who had dreamed of simple weekends, was gone. In his place stood someone who calculated every move, measured risk, and carried responsibility not just for his life, but for dozens of others. Each street had become a test, every decision a balance between caution and courage. Yet despite the danger, James remained calm. He had learned something vital. The city was no longer merely bricks and asphalt. It was a living battlefield. Every familiar route had potential, every building a vantage point, every tram line a path to survival. He began to see patterns in chaos. Which areas were targeted more frequently, which soldiers could be trusted, and which civilians panicked easily. This knowledge became his shield and his weapon. Months passed. James's reputation spread through the battalion. Soldiers called him the guide, a man who could move them through streets where others would falter. He was no longer just an ordinary citizen. He had become a cornerstone of survival. Yet every night, when the gunfire faded into distant echoes and the city seemed to pause, he thought of the man he had been. He remembered the smell of oil in the tram workshop, the laughter of passengers, and the small, quiet joys of ordinary life. That memory fueled him. It reminded him of what he was fighting for and of the responsibility he now carried. Every life he saved was a tribute to the city that had shaped him, to the streets that had been his playground and would now be his battlefield. James learned the hardest lesson early. War does not wait. It does not forgive mistakes. It does not recognize innocence or experience. It recognizes only actions, decisions, and the will to survive. And in this brutal new reality, the ordinary tram driver became someone extraordinary, not because of training or ambition, but because he knew the city better than anyone else. By the end of the first month, James was no longer just a guide or a messenger. He had become a quiet leader. Soldiers followed his directions without question. Civilians trusted him instinctively, and James realized that his ordinary life had prepared him for this extraordinary one, though he had never known it until the city itself was under fire. Weeks turned into a month, and James's role in the city became increasingly crucial. The initial chaos had settled into a brutal rhythm of survival. Soldiers moved cautiously, civilians whispered his name with gratitude, and every street was a maze of danger and opportunity. But nothing would test him like the operation that came one gray morning. A battalion had been tasked with moving through the northern districts to secure a strategic warehouse. Intelligence was fragmented, communication unreliable, and the enemy had already laid traps along the main routes. Soldiers were nervous. They had heard rumors of ambushes, mines, and sniper fire. For James, it was another set of streets he knew as well as the back of his hand. But the stakes were higher than ever. He was called to the makeshift command post. Officers looked at him with a mixture of hope and desperation. "We need someone to guide them through safely," one said. James nodded, feeling the familiar surge of responsibility. He packed light, taking only what he needed, and walked out with the men following. The streets were eerily quiet. Broken trams lay in ruins, shops were shells of their former selves, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and ash. James led the soldiers through narrow alleys, past collapsed buildings, and over bridges that creaked under their weight. Each step required attention. One wrong turn could mean disaster. Suddenly, a sharp volley of gunfire shattered the silence. James dropped instinctively, signaling the soldiers to do the same. The enemy had anticipated their route, and chaos erupted. Bullets ricocheted off walls, smoke and dust filled the air, and screams of pain and fear mixed with the roar of distant artillery. James's heart raced, but he focused. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He remembered every shortcut, every shadowed doorway, every hidden passage. Using that knowledge, he guided the battalion off the main streets and into safer paths. Soldiers followed him, sometimes blindly, trusting the calm certainty in his movements. One by one, they moved out of the kill zone, their survival dependent not on training alone, but on the intimate understanding James had of the city. Hours passed, like minutes. Each decision was critical. Cross here, wait there, move silently through the alley. He shouted minimal commands, conserving energy and clarity. At one point, a soldier stumbled and drew enemy fire. Without hesitation, James grabbed him and pulled him to cover. The soldier's eyes widened with gratitude and disbelief. This ordinary man, a tram driver just weeks ago, had become their lifeline. By dusk, the battalion had reached the warehouse. Not a single life was lost. Soldiers looked at James with a mixture of awe and respect. Officers muttered his name, barely believing that someone without formal military training had navigated them through the enemy's traps. That night, the city was quieter. But James couldn't sleep. He walked the empty streets, thinking of what had happened. He had saved dozens of lives, but he understood something profoundly unsettling. Trust and survival were fragile, and the enemy would not wait for anyone to rest. The operation had changed him. He was no longer just a messenger or guide. He was a leader, albeit an unconventional one. Soldiers began to seek his counsel, not because of rank, but because of his judgment under fire. Civilians saw him differently, too. Their gratitude was tempered with a sense of awe at the calm authority he now carried. James realized that war had accelerated his transformation. The ordinary life he had once known, a life of trams, routes, and predictable routines, was gone. In its place was a new existence defined by observation, decision, and responsibility. Every alley, every street, every ruined building became a part of a mental map that kept others alive. Yet, beneath the calm and competence, a tension lingered. Each day James had to fight the urge to act rashly, to let fear or anger dictate his choices. Every step was calculated, every movement measured. He understood now that survival was not about bravery alone. It was about discipline, strategy, and the subtle art of reading people and environments alike. The battalion's survival was a lesson James would never forget. He had learned that ordinary knowledge, knowing streets, routes, and the heartbeat of a city, could surpass any weapon. His value lay not in fighting, but in understanding the environment better than anyone else, and using that knowledge decisively when it mattered most. That night, as he sat against a crumbling wall, listening to distant gunfire, James knew one thing with certainty. He had crossed a threshold. The city had tested him. Fire had forged him, and he was no longer the man who once repaired trams. He was a survivor, a guide, and a leader, bound to a purpose he had never asked for, but could not ignore. The morning after the successful operation, James awoke to a city that felt both familiar and alien. The streets he had known so intimately were now silent witnesses to chaos and destruction. He moved among the ruins, his eyes scanning, calculating, remembering. But the victory of the previous day was tempered by a quiet, gnawing unease. Two soldiers who had followed him closely had been injured, not fatally, but enough to shake him. Their trust in his guidance had cost them pain, and the weight of that responsibility pressed on his chest. James had always been a problem solver, someone who fixed trams and routed passengers safely. Now he was tasked with fixing lives, keeping people alive, making choices that could mean the difference between life and death. That morning, he walked through the alleyways with the two wounded soldiers, offering words of encouragement, but internally wrestling with questions he had never faced. Was it enough to survive, or did survival demand compromise? The boundaries of right and wrong had blurred. The enemy was relentless, but so were the demands of survival, and with each decision, James realized he could not shield everyone. Later, at the makeshift command center, news arrived that a neighboring district had fallen under enemy control. Civilians had been trapped, some fled, others caught in crossfire. Commanders debated strategies, but James's mind returned to the familiar logic of the streets. Every alley, every bridge, every shadow held a pattern. Could he guide civilians safely, the same way he had guided soldiers? Could he carry the weight of responsibility for people he did not know personally, whose lives now intersected with his own through sheer chance? He volunteered immediately. Using his intimate knowledge of the city, he coordinated a small group of volunteers and soldiers to evacuate civilians, families, elderly, children. They all depended on someone who knew the city's veins. Each decision was calculated. He balanced speed against safety, trust against caution. Yet as the hours passed, James began to feel the cost. A young man he had guided stumbled on debris, leaving him exposed to sniper fire. James's instinct was to save him, but he also had others to protect. He shouted a command that forced the group to scatter, dragging the injured man to cover, but he could not prevent the wound from deepening. The sight of blood, so vivid and immediate, became a stark reminder. In war, survival was often selective. Even heroes had limits. That night, James sat alone, the city around him quiet except for distant echoes of gunfire. He thought about the soldiers and civilians who trusted him, about the lives he had saved, and those he hadn't. He felt anger, sorrow, and guilt, a tangled knot that refused to unravel. He realized leadership was not glory or admiration. It was a relentless burden, an endless negotiation between instinct, morality, and the cold calculations required to survive another day. Over the following weeks, James became a reluctant mentor. Soldiers began looking to him not only for guidance on navigation, but also for moral clarity. He tried to instill a principle he had learned the hard way. Decisions must be deliberate, and accountability is inseparable from survival. He taught them to move silently, to observe before acting, to prioritize human life without losing sight of strategic necessity. But the shadows of responsibility were constant. James found himself replaying every choice, questioning his judgment, haunted by faces he could not save. Each failure left a mark, a lesson carved into his understanding of human vulnerability and resilience. And yet, despite the moral weight, he knew he had to continue. Hesitation could mean more lives lost, more chaos, more irreversible consequences. One evening, as he walked through a partially destroyed market square, he encountered an old tram line, one he had once repaired. The memory was jarring. How ordinary life had seemed, how predictable and safe. The contrast between then and now was a sharp blade in his chest. He touched the cold metal of the tracks, remembering the passengers he had ferried, the simple satisfaction of a job well done. Now, those same skills, attention to detail, understanding routes, knowing how people move, were tools of survival, life-saving mechanisms in a war that offered no second chances. James began to understand a fundamental truth. Survival was not just about avoiding death. It was about managing responsibility under impossible circumstances. Every street, every decision, every human life under his influence required vigilance. Failure was not an abstract concept. It was measured in blood, in silence, in the absence of those who could no longer speak. By the end of the month, James had transformed further. The city, once a simple grid of routes and intersections, had become a complex chessboard. He understood movement, timing, trust, and risk in a way he never had before. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, he carried the weight of each life he influenced. That burden, though heavy, had also sharpened him, turning fear into strategic foresight, instinct into deliberate action. And in the quiet moments, when no one watched, James allowed himself a rare reflection. He had once been a man who repaired trams, whose world was limited to routine and predictability. War had shattered that life. But through chaos, loss, and responsibility, he had discovered something unexpected, a capacity for leadership, for moral navigation, for survival against all odds. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of the trials yet to come. The early morning fog settled over the city like a shroud, muffling distant gunfire and turning familiar streets into shadows. James moved through the alleys, his senses sharpened, eyes scanning every corner, every doorway. He had survived so far by relying on instinct, careful planning, and his intimate knowledge of the city's labyrinthine routes. But survival wasn't just about the enemy outside, it was also about the enemies within. Rumors had begun circulating, whispers of betrayal among those he had trusted, murmurs that someone might be working against the group. At first, James dismissed it, war-bred paranoia, but the evidence began to mount. Supplies went missing, instructions were deliberately ignored, and a plan for a supply run had been almost sabotaged. James realized that leadership in war wasn't just guiding others, it was reading them, understanding their motivations, predicting their failures before they happened. He called a quiet meeting with his core group, the soldiers and volunteers who had proven themselves. He spoke calmly, without anger, letting his words measure the room. "We can survive the streets, the snipers, the chaos outside," he said, "but if we can't trust each other, none of us make it." His gaze lingered on the faces around him, noting the hesitation, the discomfort, the ones who shifted nervously. Trust, he knew, was a currency harder to earn than bullets. That evening, the betrayal became explicit. One of the volunteers, a young man who had once shared a laugh with James over a tram route joke, was caught passing information to a rival faction. James didn't react with immediate violence. Instead, he observed, recording every detail, calculating the implications. Confrontation was inevitable, but timing and control mattered more than impulse. He summoned the young man privately. "Why?" James asked, his voice measured, devoid of fury. "What were you hoping to gain?" The young man stammered, offering excuses, half-truths, and fear. James listened, weighing each word, understanding the desperation that had driven betrayal. But he also understood that mercy without consequence could destroy morale, erode authority, and invite chaos. In a decision that stunned the group, James imposed a measured punishment. The young man would not die, but he would no longer hold any position of responsibility, nor would he accompany James on critical missions. Trust had been broken, and trust could not be half repaired. The message was clear. Loyalty was non-negotiable, but there was still a path to redemption for those willing to prove themselves. From that moment, James's authority solidified. The group moved with more cohesion, more discipline. Soldiers and volunteers began to look to him not just for navigation or strategy, but for moral clarity. He taught them lessons forged from experience, the importance of observation, the value of patience, the cost of misjudgment. Leadership, he realized, was a constant balance between empathy and pragmatism, between guidance and discipline. Yet the weight of decisions grew heavier. Every life he influenced carried consequence. The betrayal had reminded him that the enemy was not always external. The city itself remained dangerous. The ruins, the alleys, the shadows could conceal snipers, mines, or ambushes. But now he also had to monitor the group he led, reading body language, listening for inconsistencies, and ensuring loyalty. Every choice had ripple effects, and the line between survival and disaster was razor thin. Despite the pressure, James found clarity in routine. Each morning he checked routes, supplies, and positions. Each evening he debriefed with his trusted few, discussing outcomes, lessons, and potential threats. He began to map patterns of behavior, predicting both human error and enemy movement with unnerving precision. His knowledge of the city became not just a tactical advantage, but a psychological one. The team learned to rely on his foresight, and he learned to trust their commitment without blind faith. Weeks passed, and the group's efficiency grew. James's reputation spread quietly among nearby units. A former civilian who had transformed into a capable, decisive leader. Soldiers began referring to him as the guide, not just for streets, but for strategy, for morality under fire, for the weight of responsibility that he carried without faltering. And yet, in the quiet moments, James still wrestled with guilt and doubt. Every decision, even the right one, carried consequences he could not erase. One night, under the dim light of a burned-out street lamp, James walked alone. He thought of the people he had lost, the mistakes that could have cost lives, and the young man whose betrayal had tested him. He realized that leadership was not about being fearless. It was about facing fear, uncertainty, and betrayal, and still making decisions that preserved life, integrity, and purpose. The city, scarred and dangerous, had become both a crucible and a classroom, and he had learned to survive, adapt, and lead within it. The shadow of responsibility remained, but so did clarity. James had become more than a survivor. He was a commander, a mentor, a guide through chaos. And as dawn broke over the city, he knew that the challenges ahead would be greater, the stakes higher. But he was ready. Leadership, he understood, was not granted. It was earned in fire, forged in trial, and maintained by every choice thereafter. The city had changed overnight. Once familiar streets were now scarred with rubble, craters, and the eerie silence of abandoned neighborhoods. James moved cautiously, leading his team through the shattered avenues that had once been routine tram routes. Every step carried danger. Snipers perched in ruined buildings, hidden traps in what had been sidewalks, and the ever-present uncertainty of civilian lives caught in crossfire. James's intimate knowledge of the city became a weapon. He guided small groups through alleys invisible from the main roads, finding paths that avoided both enemy patrols and crumbling infrastructure. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. War had transformed every human interaction into a potential threat. Civilians needed guidance as much as soldiers, and James found himself negotiating with frightened families, convincing them to move to safer zones without causing panic. Every choice carried risk. A wrong turn could be fatal. A delay could be deadly. One morning, a distress call reached James. A group of civilians trapped in a bombed-out apartment block needed evacuation. The enemy had established a perimeter, making a direct approach impossible. James assessed the situation with rapid precision, mapping the safest route in his mind. "We move through the old tram tunnels," he instructed. "They're stable, and the enemy won't anticipate it." The team nodded, trusting his intuition honed through months of navigating chaos. The descent into the tunnels was tense. Darkness enveloped them, echoing each footstep. Civilians followed silently, children clinging to parents, eyes wide with fear. James's team spread out, scanning every corner, listening for any indication of enemy movement. The tunnels were suffocating, claustrophobic, and smelled of damp concrete, but they were safer than the streets above. James felt the weight of every life in the group presses down on him. One misstep could cost them all. They emerged near the apartment block, now a smoldering ruin. James directed the civilians, moving calmly yet decisively. Explosions in the distance rattled the air, sending debris fluttering around them like deadly snow. Enemy forces noticed their movement and opened fire. James ducked behind a broken wall, signaling his team. Bullets ricocheted, striking metal and stone, but his guidance kept everyone moving efficiently. Each turn, each sprint, each silent command mattered. Lives depended on it. At one point, a young boy froze in panic, unable to continue. James sprinted to him, grasping his hand firmly. "Look at me," he said, steady and calm. "We move together. You can do this." The boy nodded, and they continued step by step until they reached the safe zone. James's knowledge of the streets and his unwavering calm under fire had transformed fear into action. After the evacuation, James stood atop a ruined building, observing the city he had once navigated as a tram conductor. The streets were no longer familiar. They had become a battleground. Yet in chaos, he had found purpose. His team looked to him not just for guidance, but for hope. Civilians whispered thanks. Soldiers nodded in respect, and even in the face of destruction, James realized that leadership was about creating order and safety amid madness. War had stripped the city of innocence, but James's clarity remained. Every street, every alley, every broken building carried a memory, a strategy, a lesson. Survival was no longer just about moving through streets. It was about understanding patterns of danger, predicting enemy movement, and ensuring the safety of those who couldn't protect themselves. That night, as the city burned under distant fires, James reflected on how far he had come. From a tram mechanic to a leader under fire, he had transformed, not through ambition, but necessity. The war had forced him to adapt, to anticipate, to protect. And while the danger never ceased, he had discovered something profound. Knowledge, courage, and decisiveness could create life even in the shadow of death. The streets were on fire, but James had learned to navigate through flames without faltering. Each day became a test of resilience, every decision a matter of life or death. And as the first light of dawn pierced through smoke-filled skies, he knew the city's scars would remain, but so would its survivors, guided, protected, and led by someone who had turned ordinary knowledge into extraordinary survival. By the third month, James's role had evolved. He was no longer just a guide through the streets. He was a strategist, a protector, and in many ways a symbol of calm in a city unraveling under war. His team had grown, absorbing survivors and displaced soldiers, and every movement required careful planning. Every step could determine life or death. A new threat emerged. An enemy battalion had taken a strategic district, cutting off supply lines and endangering nearby civilians. Intelligence was scarce, and the clock was ticking. James studied maps, tracing every route he had memorized as a tram mechanic. The streets had changed, rubble and craters altering paths, but his mental map was precise. He considered multiple scenarios, weighing risks to civilians and soldiers alike. "Listen carefully," he told his team, pointing to a cluster of alleys. "We'll divide. Small units move through these tunnels, others cover the streets, and a third group creates diversions. Timing is everything." The plan required perfect coordination, silence, and trust in one another. Each decision carried moral weight. Sacrifice a few to save many, or risk everyone in a bold maneuver. The operation began at dawn. Smoke hung low, masking their movements, but also threatening visibility. Enemy patrols appeared, unpredictably, forcing James to adjust routes in real time. Bullets whizzed past, shattering glass and concrete. Civilians huddled in safe zones James had prepared days earlier. Each encounter tested not only tactical skill, but also ethical judgment. Every choice meant determining who would live and who might not. At one intersection, James spotted an enemy sniper targeting a group of children trapped in a crumbling school. His heart pounded, but hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. He directed a diversionary team to draw fire while he led a small unit through a side street, flanking the sniper. One precise move, a coordinated distraction, and the children were pulled to safety. James's knowledge of the streets had become more than survival. It was the difference between life and death. But victory always carried costs. A young recruit, barely 17, was caught in crossfire. James reached him seconds too late to prevent a wound that would take weeks to heal. He carried the boy, shouting commands to maintain the morale of his unit. War, James realized, did not reward caution alone. It punished delay, mistakes, and indecision. Each action required balancing instinct, knowledge, and moral responsibility. As the day stretched into evening, James's team secured the district. Enemy forces retreated, leaving behind devastation. Civilians were moved to safer areas, their trust in James evident in their eyes. Yet the victory was bittersweet. The weight of decisions pressed on him, gnawing at the edges of his conscience. Could he have acted differently? Could someone else have been spared? War, he understood, was not black and white. It existed in endless shades of gray, each choice carrying consequences that would echo long after the battle ended. Back at their temporary base, James mapped out routes for the following week, anticipating enemy movements and potential civilian needs. He wrote down every lesson learned, not for glory, but for survival. Every street, every alley, every intersection had a story now, stories of courage, mistakes, survival, and loss. He reflected on how a simple knowledge of a city's streets, once mundane and ordinary, had transformed into the power to save lives. Night fell, and the city glimmered with distant fires. James sat quietly, staring at the stars barely visible through smoke and ash. His team rested, but he could not. Each decision replayed in his mind, the choices, the lives saved, the injuries, the ones lost. Leadership in war was not about orders alone. It was about responsibility, foresight, and the courage to act when hesitation meant disaster. Through it all, James remained grounded in one principle: knowledge is only as powerful as the will to use it wisely. Streets, alleys, and tunnels were no longer just paths. They were lifelines, instruments of strategy, and symbols of hope. In every decision, he carried the burden of survival and the responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. By the end of the week, James had solidified his role. Soldiers looked to him not only for guidance, but for judgment. Civilians trusted him to navigate the chaos, to lead them through uncertainty with clarity and precision. And James understood, perhaps more than ever, that war was not about glory. It was about choices, survival, and the constant weighing of life against life. He had entered the war as an ordinary man, a city mechanic familiar with trams and streets. He had become something else entirely, a guardian of lives, a strategist of survival, and a man who carried the weight of an entire district on his shoulders. Every victory, every loss, every decision honed him, preparing him for the battles yet to come. After the intense battles securing the district, James finally allowed himself a moment of rest. But rest in war was always temporary. He had learned that danger wasn't only from the enemy. It could emerge from within. People, pushed to extremes, revealed sides of themselves no one expected. He had to watch every move, every word, every glance. It started subtly. Supplies went missing. Messages weren't delivered. Rumors spread of disloyalty. James observed quietly, analyzing patterns. It was never obvious, never dramatic, just a quiet shift in behavior. Trust, he realized, was a currency more valuable than food or ammunition. And here, trust could be exploited in ways that cost lives. One evening, while reviewing maps in a dimly lit room, James noticed discrepancies in the reports from one of his lieutenants, a man named Carter. Carter had always been competent, calm under fire, but something was off. He hesitated when answering questions, his tone just slightly defensive. James said nothing, observing. War had taught him that confrontation too early could destroy more than it solved. The next day, a mission went wrong. An ambush, carefully set, seemed too precise to be chance. James studied the aftermath, positions of enemy fire, timing, and the paths taken. Everything pointed to insider knowledge. A bitter realization struck. Someone within his own team had betrayed them. The feeling was heavy, almost suffocating. The line between friend and foe blurred in an instant. James confronted Carter privately. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. Carter faltered, looking away. The weight of the truth hung in the air. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," Carter whispered, finally admitting that he had shared information with enemy scouts to protect his family. James felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and sorrow. The betrayal wasn't out of malice. It was fear, love, desperation. But it was still betrayal. "Fear doesn't excuse cost," James replied. "Every action has consequences." He didn't lash out, didn't punish in rage. War had taught him that clarity, not emotion, saved lives. Carter would continue under strict oversight, his movements and communications monitored. James knew that forgiveness in war was not about absolution. It was about survival, control, and strategy. Meanwhile, the morale of the team began to fracture. Whispers of suspicion circulated, and loyalty wavered. James worked tirelessly, observing, listening, and redirecting focus. He reminded them why they were there: to protect civilians, to survive, and to maintain order amidst chaos. Leadership, he understood, wasn't about eliminating fear. It was about channeling it into discipline and purpose. Amidst the tension, James also wrestled with internal conflict. Memories of home, of ordinary days before the war, crept into his mind, contrasting sharply with the harsh reality surrounding him. He longed for the simplicity of routine, of a life without constant calculation, but he also knew that nostalgia could be dangerous, blinding him to the present. Every decision now carried stakes far beyond himself. Civilians, soldiers, and even the betrayed had to be considered. One night, as he walked the perimeter, James found a young soldier, barely 16, crying silently. "I can't do this," the boy whispered. "I'm not like you. I can't survive here." James knelt beside him. "You don't have to be me," he said. "You just have to understand what matters. Trust your instincts, but always be aware. Here, survival is a choice every single day." That conversation stayed with him, a reminder that leadership wasn't about personal heroism. It was about guiding others to survive, even when they doubted themselves. In the weeks that followed, James's team became more disciplined. Carter proved useful, restrained by oversight, but still contributing his skills. The young recruits began to trust in his judgment, learning that in war, not all enemies are obvious, and not all allies are fully trustworthy. Every day, James balanced observation, strategy, and empathy, a delicate equilibrium that was both exhausting and necessary. The city itself was changing. Once familiar streets became battle-scarred, filled with checkpoints, barricades, and hidden dangers. James's knowledge of the terrain remained invaluable, but now it carried added layers of complexity. Routes he had once known perfectly required constant adaptation, and every decision could trigger unforeseen consequences. War, he realized, was less about heroism and more about constant vigilance. By the end of the month, James had grown into his role in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had become a strategist, a mediator, and a guardian, navigating not only the dangers of the battlefield, but also the fragile trust within his own ranks. Betrayal had taught him caution, empathy had taught him patience, and experience had taught him that survival demanded both heart and mind. As night fell over the battered city, James reflected, he was no longer the ordinary tram mechanic who knew every street. He was a leader forged in fire, tempered by betrayal, and guided by a clear, unwavering principle. In war, knowledge, trust, and the courage to make hard decisions were the only constants that could save lives. The city was no longer just streets and familiar corners. It had become a chessboard of threats, civilian zones, and enemy strongholds. James, once a simple tram mechanic, now found himself orchestrating operations that determined life or death for hundreds. Every choice carried a weight he had never imagined, a responsibility that pressed on his shoulders like the heaviest load. The orders came down for an offensive to reclaim a key district controlled by enemy forces. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance, but James knew better. Cities were unpredictable. People were unpredictable. He had learned that fear could cause allies to falter and civilians to act in ways that complicated even the best-laid plans. Preparation required not only maps and routes, but understanding human behavior in the face of terror. He reviewed the plans in the dim light of the command room. Each map marked not just strategic points, but safe passages for civilians, evacuation routes, and potential ambush spots. James's experience navigating the city under fire made him invaluable. He could anticipate the paths people would take, the buildings they would flock to, and the choke points where chaos could erupt. Knowledge, he realized, could save lives, but knowledge alone wasn't enough. He had to make decisions no one would see, weighing the lives of soldiers against civilians, allies against strangers. The operation began at dawn. The streets, once familiar, were now a tangle of barricades and hidden explosives. James moved with his team, coordinating communications, guiding troops, and adjusting plans on the fly. Every turn was a potential trap, every intersection a moral decision. When the first building housing civilians was under fire, James hesitated. Do they strike now and risk civilian casualties, or wait and risk the enemy regrouping? His mind raced, calculating probabilities, anticipating reactions, and measuring the cost of inaction. The answer came in an instant, a choice that would define him as a leader. He rerouted the troops, creating a diversion, and sent a small squad to evacuate the civilians. It was dangerous, nearly suicidal, but it worked. Families were saved, and soldiers avoided unnecessary casualties. The operation continued, tense and precise. James observed every detail, aware that one mistake could unravel hours of planning and cost lives. By midday, the district was partially reclaimed. The enemy had retreated, but the streets bore scars of the battle, burned-out cars, shattered windows, and silent homes where fear lingered in every shadow. James walked through the area, seeing the faces of civilians who had survived but lost everything. Their eyes held a mix of relief and trauma, and he realized that even when lives were spared, the cost of war was permanent. It wasn't just buildings or supplies, it was the erosion of trust, the loss of innocence, and the weight of witnessing horrors beyond comprehension. The aftermath brought more challenges. Some soldiers questioned his decisions, arguing that he had risked too much to save civilians. Others silently thanked him, understanding the delicate balance he maintained. James listened, weighed arguments, and reinforced discipline, knowing that leadership wasn't about popularity. It was about making the hardest choices with clarity and courage. The burden of command was relentless, and he accepted it, understanding that the responsibility for every outcome rested squarely on his shoulders. That night, he returned to the temporary command post, exhausted. Maps were marked, reports filed, and strategies recalibrated. James sat alone for a moment, reflecting on the day. He had navigated streets under fire, saved lives, and made impossible decisions, but the weight of those choices lingered. War, he understood, was not just about surviving. It was about ensuring others survived and carrying the invisible scars of those decisions long after the battles ended. James realized that he had changed yet again. The city, the streets, and the people within them were no longer just familiar. They were lives intertwined with his decisions, reflections of his judgment, and reminders of the costs of command. Each day in the war was a lesson, each choice a test, and each life saved or lost a measure of who he had become. As he prepared for the next phase of operations, James understood something fundamental. Knowledge of streets, courage under fire, and leadership were crucial, but the true measure of a commander was the ability to carry the moral weight of war without losing the humanity that allowed him to make those choices in the first place. The city was scarred, the people were battered, and the enemy remained, but James had forged himself into more than a survivor. He had become a guardian, navigating the impossible, one decision at a time. The morning light revealed the city in a fragile quiet. James had anticipated enemy movements, fortified key positions, and organized evacuations. Yet, as he reviewed the reports and maps, a subtle anomaly caught his eye. Communications that didn't match the reality on the ground. Messages had been intercepted, and some units had been delayed inexplicably. The calculations of war, precise and brutal, were suddenly off by a factor James couldn't ignore. He called a meeting with his officers. Everyone seemed tense but competent. Yet in the corner of the room, one junior officer avoided eye contact, fidgeting with the map on the table. James noted the hesitation. It was familiar. Years of navigating danger had taught him that fear often masked guilt, and subtle shifts in behavior could expose hidden threats. For hours, James reviewed movements, compared logs, and interrogated his team carefully. It became evident someone within his ranks had leaked information to the enemy. The realization was chilling. Trust, once fractured, was nearly impossible to rebuild in a war zone. Every decision he had made, every route plotted, every life spared, was now vulnerable to sabotage from within. James's mind raced. He couldn't act rashly. The wrong accusation could destroy morale and worsen the situation, yet inaction was equally dangerous. The city, his people, his team, everything he had fought to protect, depended on his ability to identify the traitor without tipping off the enemy. Strategy and instinct converged as he began piecing together subtle clues, mismatched reports, delayed responses, unexplained absences during key moments. Late in the day, James arranged for a controlled test. He fed contradictory orders to different units, observing who acted on sensitive information before it should have reached them. It wasn't easy. The stakes were impossibly high. Soldiers' lives hung in the balance, and civilians were still in zones that could become dangerous. But James had learned to navigate impossible choices, balancing risk against reward with calculated precision. By nightfall, the evidence was undeniable. The junior officer, desperate and fearful, had been feeding intelligence to the enemy, believing that compliance would ensure his own survival. James confronted him quietly, away from the others, and saw a flicker of genuine terror in his eyes. There were no dramatic speeches, no angry outbursts, just the suffocating weight of inevitability. "Why?" James asked softly, controlling his voice. "Why put all of this at risk?" I thought if I helped them, they'd leave me alive," the officer stammered. "I didn't know. James studied him for a long moment. Survival instincts were natural, but in war, one selfish act could unravel the lives of hundreds. The officer had underestimated the stakes and overestimated his ability to remain unnoticed. James's role as a commander wasn't to punish blindly, but to enforce survival, not just for himself, but for everyone depending on him. The consequences were swift but measured. The officer was relieved of command, placed in secure confinement, and the remaining team reorganized under strict supervision. James emphasized transparency, recalibrated operations, and ensured that each unit understood the importance of loyalty and vigilance. Trust had been shaken, but it was not irreparable. The team, now aware of the betrayal, became more disciplined, more focused, more reliant on one another. James knew that the harsh lesson would resonate far longer than any reprimand could. The city streets, scarred from battle and chaos, now mirrored James's own mental state. Every corner a potential threat, every building a reminder of vulnerability, yet still navigable with the right knowledge and caution. The weight of command had shifted. He was no longer just saving lives in the immediate sense. He was shaping the culture, the discipline, the very resilience of his team. Every decision, every correction, every lesson learned under duress had consequences far beyond a single day. That night, as James walked through the darkened streets with a few trusted lieutenants, he reflected on the lessons war had forced upon him. Betrayal could emerge anywhere, in the quietest corners, from the most unassuming individuals. Vigilance was no longer a skill, It was a lifeline. Leadership was no longer about knowledge of streets or tactics. It was about understanding human nature in its rawest, most dangerous forms. And yet in that darkness, a small sense of resolve glimmered. Despite deception, danger, and fatigue, James recognized the potential for strength that emerged from surviving not just the enemy, but the shadows within. His team, tested by fire and betrayal, now understood the cost of error and the value of disciplined courage. The night deepened, but James's watchfulness did not fade. The city slept fitfully, civilians unaware of the intricacies of survival that kept them safe. James had become more than a mechanic, more than a guide, more than a commander. He had become a guardian of both streets and souls, navigating the impossible with eyes wide open, knowing that the next threat could come from anywhere, and that vigilance was the only path to hope.